Fire and Emergency Services Instructor, 8th Edition, Chapter 6, Classroom Instruction, Part 2.
Instructors use questions to receive feedback and stimulate student interest. It provides an opportunity for students to openly express their ideas and opinions, something that's important because there's nothing worse than a group of people in a room talking about an issue, and it may be like a sketchy issue or maybe a sore subject with guys in the department, but it's good to kind of give people that space so that they can express their ideas and their opinions. I was teaching traffic incident management the other day down at Bartholomew County. Had a group of about 20 law enforcement officers, no firefighters, no EMS, no towing recovery, just the guy who I was teaching with, me, and about 20 law enforcement guys. And one of the first things that we got asked in that course was why firemen do what they do. And so one of the students kind of went on a tirade for a few moments, and then the student behind him said, yeah, I feel the same way too, but they didn't know at that point in time that I was firing EMS and fire, so they were kind of like, the sheriff looks at me and he's like, this doesn't reflect things across the entire county. And I'm like, well, sir, I understand that, but at the same time, if they're having an issue with fire first response, then that's something that needs to be worked out on the scene before you get into a situation like we had in California a few years ago when the captain was arrested on a scene for not moving his engine. So being on the scene, that's not the time and the place to kind of hash that out. But just an example of why you want to allow that within your class, because you never know. A lot of different people have a lot of different experiences, and they have a different perspective on things. So always allow that in your class. You'll find that you can engage students using that. Provoke interest that generates related questions. So when we started the course, we talked about the flipped classroom. We talked about ways to put magic into your lectures. We talked about being a fireman and all that stuff. But those videos are in there designed to get you guys thinking about the fire service and the necessity of the fire service instructor, especially on the company level, and especially since it's required for Indiana Fire Officer 1. That's actually part of the NFPA standard that all candidates for Officer 1 have to have Instructor 1 at a minimum. Review and summarize your information. Package it up. Make sure people have it if they need it. And then assess whether students have achieved the lessons learning objectives. So every objective that you go through, every one that we go through, you want to make sure that they're hitting all those objective points. Follow guidelines for developing and asking questions. Review your main questions in advance. Write and arrange them in a logical order. Phrase them clearly. Ask only one question at a time. Be sure that the wording of the question does not make the answer obvious. So you'll go through the course, you'll look at and the IFSTA curriculum does a real good job at this. They provide review questions to kind of help you tie up objectives and put everything together. But as far as a logical order, you don't want to have a question that's 10 slides ahead of all the material that you're going to cover. You want to make sure that question is asked at the appropriate time. You want to make sure you phrase them clearly, one question at a time, like I said, and then be sure that the wording doesn't make the answer obvious or doesn't make the answer guessable. Allow wait time. I normally give you guys about 15 to 30 seconds to respond, just to see if everybody's on the page. At that point in time, after that, I'll start calling on students directly to get their viewpoints and their feedback. Never use a question to intimidate, embarrass, or humiliate a student. That will go to your credibility. That will get you a certain reputation of not being very student friendly. And after a good portion of the time of that happening, you will most likely not be instructing a lot of stuff anymore. Distribute them evenly. So I don't want to pepper Jordan with, 5 questions in a row, and I don't want to nail Jeff with 7 questions in a row, and I don't want to throw anything too hard at Robbie. Make sure you're distributing questions evenly across the class. Ask them in a variety of levels and a variety of types. So this is a pretty strong classroom here. So we're going to focus on how this works in company level operations and department level operations. But you want to ask the beginner questions, the intermediate questions, and the advanced questions to kind of keep those students engaged in the presentation. And then ask open-ended questions and just kind of switch it up. You want to adapt the questions to the student's ability level. So you're not going to ask a brand new firefighter 1-2, you're not going to ask him about the ins and outs of ICS 300. You're just going to throw him off base and get him confused. He'll turn off and kind of go zonky for a little bit and then most likely not participate in class at all moving forward. Ask appropriately challenging questions. Avoid asking questions too soon. And follow up on student answers. Kind of give that student feedback as to what's going on. Instructors can use types of questions to start discussion, stimulate thinking, and provide feedback. And that's what you're trying to do. Simple as that. Start a discussion, get your students to think, get feedback on what you've taught. Remember we talked the other day about feedback as a continuous process. Instructor speaks, looks for feedback, students give feedback, instructor adjusts, so on and so forth throughout the entire presentation. Know the types of questions that there are. Rhetorical. You're not really looking for an answer, but you're trying to get people to think about stuff. Close-ended question, usually answered with a yes or a no. Open question, open-ended, so you get student feedback and student information. For example, you would say the Halligan tool was, in what year was the Halligan tool introduced? They give you one answer, or you talk about the many different types of questions there are. Pick one, talk about it. That's an open-ended question. Direct questions, overhead questions, relay questions, and redirected questions. Basic guidelines for responding to students' answers. Use positive reinforcement. Tell them, yes, that's correct, great job, excellent, outstanding, whatever you want to use. You want to positively reinforce the correct portion of the student's answer. And then always provide correct answers if the students don't. So be prepared to feed that information to the students if necessary. Know how to answer student questions. Provide the answer to a question when you know the question. Direct a question to another participant when that other participant will respond correctly. Defer questions that are beyond the scope of the course. Defer questions that require time to research for the correct answer. So what are some instructor-led training approaches to the teaching in the fire and emergency services? Anybody? Let's go back and see if it's back here. There we go. There you go. Anybody else? Off we go. So let's discuss distance learning and student-led instruction for the fire and emergency services. Computer-based training like this allows students to work at their own pace. Instead of having to worry about keeping on pace with 3 or 4 different students, you hand them the information, you say, here you go, you take this information, study it, come back to the instructor if you have any issues. It's something that Ivy Tech has used for a while, and if you go through their fire science program out of Lawrence campus, they actually have 90% of the fire science curriculum is actually online. So you're able to take it in an online distance education course. And then we're using it for this course. What do you guys like and not like about this type of course? Any feedback? That's the key right there. We set this, and the webinar idea actually came from Charlie Heflin. I was going to record everything and put it on YouTube, but Charlie's like, "Hey, you should do a webinar and do it live." And I'm like, "Do you know how expensive that is?" And he's like, "No, just look it up. You'll find some free services." So I did. I found that free. Yeah, that's 100% free service. So right. The trick of it is you've got to have students that can work through the material at their own pace, but they keep themselves accountable to the material. It is extremely self-directed. Extremely. It's different. And the reason why we went with a hybrid course was for guys like you and guys like, in fact, everybody in the room, because you've got other stuff going on. You've got a life outside of the fire service. You have expectations from the family at home, and so this gives you an opportunity to take a class that you may not have taken before. And we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to everybody who wanted to be a part of the class. You got instructors must ensure that students are using compatible software, internet browsers, operating systems, word processing programs, document readers, and unique software that's needed for the course. Did you guys notice that there was a lot of stuff in the pre-course that was around video and Word and PowerPoint and other things like that? That was by design, just to make sure you guys were ready for the class, had the technology necessary, and had everything in place. Now, as far as internet browsers, the software is not really that browser dependent. You can do it on Internet Explorer, you can do it on Chrome, you can do it however you like to. But the big piece of the software, that when you're using software, you have to make sure that everybody has access to it. So like, for example, all the webinar stuff is done through free conference call, and then all the YouTube stuff is on there done through YouTube. So, but that's a big one. Make sure your students have the access to technology that they're going to need. Familiarize yourselves with all the software used in the system. Wikis, blogs, and file sharing services, Dropbox, WordPress, Wikipedia, social networking systems. I think at some point in time, everyone in this room has either Facebooked or texted me and asked a question, which works. Live streaming audio and video, that's something that the fire service is starting to play with to some degree. Chief? But you've emailed me, sir. And I forgot to mention the email, so thank you for holding me accountable. Chat sessions. There's a chat box on here for the webinar guys. So if they have a question, they can flag me down in the chat, and I can take care of what's going on. Teleconferencing and web conferencing. We use free conference call. It works pretty well. And then course management software, the Resource One that we use. That is courtesy of the textbook the textbook writer. And a lot of different textbooks throughout the state are being used. If you're an instructor, normally all you have to do is get an authorization from your chief. And once you have an authorization from your chief to use that software or to be able to put those things together, the textbook providers will actually give you the information you need. So Resource One is a big thing. It's for all the ISTA books. They give you the entire curriculum. They give you a lot of the lesson plans. They give you a lot of the slides. All you have to do is follow their program. There are a few adjustments for instructional delivery. Wait longer for students to answer questions. There's a lag, about a 30-second lag between the live classroom and the streaming stuff. So I have to give the webinar guys a few more minutes to have that information come through, and then they talk back to me. Limit your movements. Like I said the first day, I'm a mover. I generally prefer to be on my feet in front of the classroom, walking around, moving around so I can see everything that's going on. But for this course, you guys have probably noticed that I've sat right here in this chair for a good portion of it. And the reason why is that's as far as my onboard microphone will let me go. I tried a Bluetooth headset, didn't work. Tried another Bluetooth headset, it didn't work. So I basically had to limit my movements to right here so I could be heard through everything. Direct questions, individual locations participating in the lesson. You guys will notice I typically go through and I ask the classroom the question, and then I'll turn around to the webinar guys. I'll say, webinar guys, what say you? You have to give very clear instructions for media transitions. So if I'm going between a slideshow and a video, I have to tell the student, I have to tell you guys, hey, we're switching from this to this. Hang on a second, we'll be there as soon as we can. And then you have to allow time to deal with any technical issues that may occur during the lesson. Technical issues during the lesson. Anybody have any ideas what those might be? Wi-Fi failure, internet issues. Leah? Computer crashes. Okay. Lose power. What I normally do is I set up and I run the YouTube stuff, I get it going, and then I make sure that everything else is set up before I move on. And then I'm sure you guys have noticed that at the very beginning of the class, I'll ask, if I see folks on the webinar, I'll ask them specifically, hey, are you ready to go? Can you hear me? Are there any issues? But that's something you have to do, because if you don't do that, you're going to have a student that's going to miss 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes of the class, and they'll have to go back and review the material at a later point in time. No, sir. Thank you for your help. All righty. During self-directed learning, students are solely responsible for achieving objectives. As the instructor, I am not involved in the delivery of the training. There are several meetings to examine the progress of independent study. Not all training programs, particularly basic level skill programs, are suited to this type of instruction. So in distance education, you're going to be talking about things like Instructor 1, Instructor 2, 3, Officer 1. You might do Safety Officer. You might do a lot more of the advanced level courses. But as far as like Fire 1, 2, and EMT, those are probably courses that are going to be better off done with a live classroom delivery. Doesn't mean you can't flip the classroom a little, but it means that you have to pay attention to what you're going to lecture about during a live delivery. Adapt the teaching method to students' learning styles. It is enables students who would not succeed in a typical learning environment. It's not a substitute for the instructor. The individual works with others to meet certain requirements and share experiences. Again, while you're putting squads on the first day of class. And you work under the supervision of an instructor. Because what I do usually once or twice a day, I'll go back through, I'll look at Moodle, I'll look at your guys' grades, I'll see what's been turned in, I'll see what hasn't been turned in, and then I'll reach out and say, well, where are you at on as far as this topic, or this topic? So it's a good thing because I get immediate feedback on what you guys are retaining and what you guys are learning. And that's huge because then I can adjust my delivery to meet those needs. Individualized instruction is based upon 3 premises: the student's needs and their preferred learning style, the learning objectives or competencies required by the occupation, instructional strategies and media that fit the needs of the student. So you have to be able to get through all 3 of these in order to do individualized instruction, distance ed. Many organizations use individualized instruction techniques and training. Learning activity packets, you guys have seen a couple of those. Tutorial instruction and programmed learning. So what is distance learning? When we talk about distance learning, what do we mean? Audio-visual media. Learning is taken at a decentralized location. How about student-led instruction? What do you guys think about student-led instruction? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? When we're talking, Chief? When you talk about flipping the classroom and doing things like that, that's more student-led instruction. And depending upon who you have in the class, you know, you can break out all the topics, flip the classroom. You do your lectures, you do your instructional classroom time mostly on just skills. You push out the video before, you have everybody go through it, they look at it, they develop questions, they figure out what they need to ask you. So when you come into the classroom, or when you go out on the drill ground, instead of spending an hour inside and an hour on the drill ground and an hour to clean up, you do your education beforehand, so then you can go straight to the drill ground when the guys get there, and you can give them their tasks and move them along where they need to go. But student-led, there's a lot of individuals in here that have different skill sets, different types. You know, if we're doing hazmat refresher, I would more than likely turn to Chief Allison as the hazmat guy and say, hey, look, can you help me out here? Make sense? Kevin says it can be a good thing in the right setting. Objective 9, explain the use of training aids to encourage active learning. So here's the guidelines for using visual aids. You want to illustrate a single concept or idea in each visual. That way you don't get everybody going off in 3 or 4 different directions. Just you do one thing at a time, one thing per image. Only introduce audio-visual training aids just before presenting them. Hey guys, here's a video. It's going to take about 15 minutes. Let's sit down, let's watch those. Display steps in sequence individually, especially if you're looking at a multi-step evolution. You want to make sure that you cover those tasks one by one by one. And then you want to avoid using multiple training aids simultaneously. So I don't want to have a video going and, you know, have an activity going and trying to lecture on top of all that. Training aids engage student interest and encourage active learning. Apply training aids in ways that emphasize the message. Pre-coursework, Salman Khan. Keep going back to him, but it's a good example. What was the message out of that lecture? That's a topic in there. I put that in because I wanted you guys to think about getting away from the traditional classroom. Because this wasn't going to be a traditional class. This was going to be a flipped class where you guys would get the material and go through it. You want to keep eye contact with your students. Kind of go back around the room, see who's making eye contact with you, see their body language and things like that. Make sure you're looking at your students to kind of feed where they are and make sure they're actively learning. Ensure enough space for all students to see. So if we're doing an evolution, if I'm showing you guys how to prepare a state training form, I want to make sure everybody can see it. Either I've got it projected or I'm doing it to where you guys can see it, but everybody has to be able to see it at the same time. Ensure that all students in the presentation room can hear the audio. That's a big one. That's why we really have watched a lot of videos in class. I need to invest in a good set of speakers to make sure that we have those accessible so you guys can hear what's going on. Display visual training aids above the eye level of seated students. So we've got our visual training aid. It's all at roughly above the eye level of everybody. Everybody can see it. It's nice and wide. It's all the way out to the edges of the screen. That way everybody can see everything that's on the same page. So how can training aids encourage active learning? Just talked about it. Interact with, touch. What's that? Grab their attention. Right, right. 90% of seeing and or remembering and seeing. Robbie? Gives them a break from the boring lecture part of it. Illustrates a single idea. Okay. What's that, Chief? Step-by-step process. Objective 10. Explain the contribution of structured exercises in the classroom. A case study is a description of a problem that an organization has dealt with and may face in the future. Has anyone ever read a case study that applies to the fire service? How about a NIOSH report on a firefighter fatality? What about a NIST bulletin? One of those? Case studies are good because it gives you the opportunity to see what similarly trained people like ourselves have gone through in the past. You know, when I took fire science at Ivy Tech, we talked a lot about the athletic club fire and the Bob's Merrill fire and notable fires around Indianapolis. We talked about the Ramada crash. We talked about a whole slew of those. But a case study gives you a framework to learn about something that you're going to have to deal with. It reviews and discusses detailed accounts of past events. It tends to be more effective for experienced personnel. Students develop their ability to examine facts. And the students must be willing to defend their suggestions. Any memorable case studies you've read, Joey? Coconut Grove, Worcester Fire, anything? And especially with 1403, I've seen some guys around that say, yeah, I'm 1403 certified, and you're like, okay, what exactly is that supposed to mean? You're 1403 certified. That you're following the standard? Okay. I'm not sure what the expectation is. Chief, can you illuminate us on that? And I was trying to articulate that there's no like formalized state formal certification in 1403. So I mean, you guys do a lot of training burns over there at Green. Johnson, quite a few of them over there. So pretty neat. I just going back to what you just said, Chief. It's something that you need to look through and look at, especially the ones that impact training and education. So, in role play, students act out a character in a scenario. There are advantages and there are disadvantages. An advantage, they apply their knowledge. They practice in lifelike conditions. It improves understanding. And it can identify multiple approaches to a problem. However, they're very involved. They take time to perform. And the students have to have the ability to involve themselves in the characters. So we'll do a few of these coming up in the next following chapters just to kind of give you guys some experience in them. But when what do we commonly role play in training? What are some common scenarios that we use role play in? Other students, perhaps, sometimes. Patients in EMS simulations. Smoking up a house instead of having a fire, kind of on the same path. Moulage. Moulage makes things a lot easier sometimes, especially with complex EMS evolutions. They represent real-life situations. They're practical training evolutions or computer-based training. They permit students to experience a situation and see the results of their decision without the negative results, but ensure that they effectively reflect the equipment, procedures, protocols, and situations. Students inspect, use, test, and evaluate equipment in field and laboratory experiences. They're typically given a tour of an installation. They can see models of equipment. The instructor should demonstrate the steps required and observe the students. Students may work independently or in groups. Why do we do a lot of group work in the fire service? A lot of what we do is in groups. Small units, engine companies, squad company, EMS. How do structured exercises contribute to the learning process? Structured exercise like a training evolution, psychomotor skill sheet, hands-on skills. Right, exactly. Case studies in the structured process. Better understanding during a subject. Learning objective 11. Describe the factors that affect learning. What are some learning obstacles? What factors affect that? External pressures. You got stuff going on outside. Learning environment. We talked about this in one of the previous chapters, but you have to make sure that you are creating not just a physical environment that's good for learning, but a mental environment as well that's good for learning as well, additionally. You have students that will be anxious or they'll be bored. That's why you got to mix it up. Keep your students performing for you as much as you can. Personal feelings on a subject. This can be huge, especially when you got a couple guys in the department that just don't mix together. Their personal feelings get involved, and that creates conflict. Lectures that are too long. Lack of training aids. When you guys were talking about 655, it's dry material. So, I felt like you guys needed a break because I could see it on your guys' faces that you needed a minute to kind of reset, refresh, and move from there. So how long is too long? Your thoughts? 45 minutes of teaching time? Yeah, no, how often should you take breaks? You got to break it up. I mean, I'm telling you right now. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I can't stand death by PowerPoint. That's why I'm teaching off one, but I'm trying to pepper in some more information. Exactly. Precisely. You got it, Chief. Because we've all had those instructors. We have all had those instructors that sit there, they read directly off the screen, they click forward to the next slide, they read that slide. You guys have the book. My job is to paraphrase the book and break it down and reinforce it. That's what we need to do. Kevin, 45-minute lecture, 15-minute break maybe, 30-minute lecture, 20-minute hands-on, 10-minute break. You got to break it up. And then you've also got to have training aids for what you're doing. So if I'm teaching a CPR class, what's 2 things I need for training aids? Dummies, AED, airway, bag valve mask. The last time we did mega codes, what I did is I took a dummy, I pulled the head off it, I put Fred the head at the end of the table. So I had Fred the head here, I had the dummy here, and I had all the other equipment down here at the bottom of the table. And the guys looked at me, they're like, what are we doing? I'm like, work your code. There's your airway, there's your compressions, there's your equipment. Go to it. Get her done. But it would be goofy to teach CPR without having mannequins. Just like it'd be weird to teach this class without the syllabus, without the videos, without all the stuff that go with it. Your goal should be to give your students as much information as possible and kind of drive them towards learning about it outside the classroom on their own. That way they can grow through the fire service. Someone once told me the day that I stopped learning stuff in the fire service was the day I needed to get out. You know, I've held true to that for the last, 10 or so years. So I try to learn something in fire service wise every week. Facebook's great for that. Close calls are good for that. You see there's a lot of dash cam stuff you see today. There's a lot of fire cam stuff you see today. Just eat that stuff up and go from there. A learning plateau is a break in upward progress. So as you teach, the student will progress, and then they'll just kind of stop. Get them re-engaged, they'll go, and they'll stop. Why is that bad for us? Jeff? Why is a learning plateau a bad thing? Okay. Can you place it? Okay. Robbie? Okay. Anybody else? So how do we overcome that? You guys are starting to touch on it. Keep them engaged, keep them motivated, training aids, videos, limit the lectures, limit PowerPoint, limit your use of PowerPoint. Start out with a basic company evolution, go through it. Next month, build a little onto it. Keep building and building and building until you're where you're supposed to be. So what factors can affect learning? Outside influences? What? Oh, my Facebook post last time? I said something on Facebook. Basically, my wife had brought me a letter about a sensitive subject, and I'm not going to get into that much. But I was a little miffed. But then I turned around and I looked at it. I'm like, you know what? I had a good day. I had a good day teaching. I'm not going to let this ruin my day. So I went on. That's all that was about. Just, just a little comment off the side. But, anything else? What other factors can affect learning? Anxiety or boredom? Lack of training aids? Training environment? Lighting, heating, cooling, all kinds of stuff? Okay. Let's talk about individual student needs that an instructor might face in the classroom. And at the same time, describe reasonable accommodations that instructors can take to address a student's learning disability. I have at least 3 people in this department that have verified learning disabilities. So for those guys, we break things down a little differently. We take our time, we go a little slower, or we speed it up sometimes if that's what they need. If they need help preparing for a test, we'll sit down and we'll go over the material with them to try to get them on the same page. As Chris said earlier, we talked about the student that was in Brown County who was deaf, who had to have a translator go through fire school with them as well. Some students are going to need additional assistance to overcome their level of literacy. So there are adult education programs. You see these offered a lot at the career centers around the area. Hoosier Hills, Wayne Township, a couple other places. But they offer adult education programs for adults that require that information. You have your employee assistance programs, or EAPs, and then you have personal tutors. So there was at one point in time, there was a young man in this department who was going for an EMTB certification, and he had not done too well on a first state test. And I had a book at home that was all just nothing but scenarios and questions and little flashcards. I actually have it with me to my van. And I gave it to him. I said, this is mine. I need it back. But you take this, and you take as much time as you need and get through your test. Student took about a month, 2 months, however much time he needed to before remediation. He sat down, went through the book, passed it on the next attempt. But you have to be able to provide that information to students that, may have an issue. Make sure textbooks, tests, and handouts have adjustments for low literacy. Short sentences and paragraphs, double-spaced lines, directional headings and wide margins, type that is large enough to be read easily, and simple vocabulary. I'll tell you right now that putting together a lesson plan like this would be hard for me because I use the big words. I use the mayonnaise words. And the guys on this department will never let me forget that I use the mayonnaise words. I had one of our guys look at me the other day, and he's like, I didn't have any mayonnaise words. I looked at him, I said, that's because you happen to be from the hills and hollers, and it's okay. You don't have to have all that information, as long as you get the gist of it. But you have to be prepared to do that for students because that's a reasonable accommodation. First class, I asked you guys, anybody likely to have issues? Anybody like to have questions? Let me know. That way we can work around you and help you get to where you need to be. They're neurological in origin, and they affect an individual's ability to perform certain actions. Understand or think. They may be, 21 years old operating at the thought level of a 16 to 17-year-old. You have to adjust for that. They may have trouble with the spoken or the written word. So find out what works for them and go that direction. Perform mathematical functions or perform fine psychomotor skills. What do we do for psychomotor skills for a student that needs accommodation? Any ideas? Any thoughts? We do a lot of psychomotor stuff in EMS. A lot of people get freaked out when they see that psychomotor sheet. And they say, oh my God, I have to do all this. But you start out very slow and you teach them how to get through the skills. And you teach and you repeat and you teach and you repeat and you get it through. One of my biggest beefs with EMS classes and how they're done sometimes is they don't work on the psychomotor skills from day one. So day one of EMT class, I'm a firm believer. You should be taking blood pressures. You should be able to do vitals after the first or second class. But a lot of instructors will hold that information until the end And then they end up slighting the student and penalizing the student because of something they created. ADA, one of our federal laws that talks about learning, puts learning disabilities in 3 major categories. You have your speech and language disorders, where you have difficulty producing speech sounds. You have academic skills disorders, difficulty reading, writing, and calculating. And you have students that have miscellaneous learning disabilities. They have difficulty performing fine motor skills or learning nonverbal skills. Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Brooklyn Elementary right over here is a Title I school. So there's all kinds of different stuff that the kids have access to through Title I. They'll send them home with workbooks. They'll send them home with, extra learning activities. They'll send them home with all kinds of stuff. The state law specifically says that you have to provide students to an equal education that a student without learning disabilities would have. It's a free and appropriate public education is the phrase. And if you have kids that are disabled or that have a learning disability, autism, those various things, every year you have to go back and look at an individualized plan or an IEP. And every year you sit down at the conference, you talk to your kids as teacher, and you tell them, okay, well, this is what's going on. They'll go back, they'll look at their records from last year, they'll look at their goals from this year, and then they'll put your student on basically on a frame where they think they are, and then they write their individualized education plan accordingly. But that's huge. Like over at Waverly, I know you guys, that's the Mooresville Center. The Martinsville Center is over at Smith. Smith has the developmental preschool, and it has a lot of the learning disabled children as well. So, but there's a lot of accommodations that are given, like Chief said, because of the ADA. Basic accommodations: tutoring, developing individualized instruction, providing additional feedback on progress, allowing more time on tests, moving students with disabilities closer to the front of the classroom, providing a reader or for audio recording of assigned reading, and assigning a student to take notes for another. Those are all basic accommodations you can make for a student if necessary. You get an ebook. So what accommodations might you make for a student with a learning disability? Closer to the front of the classroom. He's smiling and nodding. That's it. Kevin says, have another student take notes. More times on the test. Audio book. A little extra time on testing. You can't provide a reader or audio recording, Kevin says. You can't pay attention to them when they need breaks. Perfect. Perfect. Anything else for the learning disability guys? You got to be flexible. That's one of the neat things about being an instructor. You have to be flexible to the needs of the class. It's about getting them the information. Whether you've got somebody that has a learning disability or not, you can't. You gotta give people a little bit of wiggle room sometimes. And then sometimes, you have students that don't follow the course rules, that don't do any of the coursework. As long as you're in the webinar, as long as you're on the webinar and I can see you on the webinar, you get full credit. Again, we go back to, the specifics of the class. That's why it's a hybrid. You guys should physically be here Saturday to go through some of the skills. No problem. If you guys don't have any other questions, we're good for this evening.